Bennett, and I'm 45 years old. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder where everything started to go wrong. People who hear my story usually think it began the day my sons fought at my wife's funeral. The truth is, it started many years earlier, long before any of us realized it. My wife, Eleanor, and I grew up in neighboring towns outside Cleveland, Ohio. We met when we were teenagers working part-time at the same neighborhood grocery store. She was the kind of person who could make anyone smile. I was shy, hard-working, and more comfortable fixing broken shelves than talking to people. Somehow she saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. We married when we were both 22 with very little money but endless dreams. Our first apartment was so small that the kitchen table also served as my workbench. We laughed through every struggle because we believed that as long as we had each other, we already had everything that mattered. After several years of working for other people, we decided to risk everything and open our own hardware store. We borrowed money, worked 7 days a week, and often stayed open until long after sunset. There were nights when Eleanor handled the register while I unloaded heavy deliveries in the back. Some months we barely earned enough to pay our bills, but she never complained. She always reminded me that success wasn't measured by how much money we made, but by the honesty with which we earned it. Slowly, our little store became known throughout the community. Customers trusted us because we treated them like neighbors instead of numbers. Over the years, the business grew into one of the most respected family-owned stores in the county, and I believed our future was finally secure. The greatest blessing of our lives came with the birth of our first son, Michael. 2 years later, Ryan was born. From the moment they arrived, Eleanor and I promised that no matter how successful the business became, our family would always come first. We closed the store early to attend baseball games, school concerts, and parent-teacher meetings. Every Sunday evening we gathered around the dinner table where phones were put away and everyone shared stories about their week. Eleanor insisted those dinners would become memories our boys would carry forever. She was right. For years, our home was filled with laughter, playful arguments, birthday celebrations, and holiday traditions that made every season special. Michael was the responsible one from an early age. He loved helping me organize tools in the store and dreamed of running the business someday. Ryan had a different personality. He was adventurous, outgoing, and always looking for new ideas. While Michael preferred routine, Ryan wanted excitement. Their personalities often clashed, but they always found their way back to each other. I watched them build tree houses together, defend one another at school, and celebrate every victory side by side. Whenever people asked if I worried about sibling rivalry, I proudly answered, "Not these two, they're best friends." As the years passed, our hardware store became more successful than I'd ever imagined. We bought a comfortable home, hired more employees, and earned enough to give our sons opportunities we never had growing up. Eleanor remained the heart of our family. She constantly reminded the boys that money could disappear overnight, but character would stay with them forever. Before every birthday, every Christmas, and every family vacation, she would say the same words: "Never let money become more important than the people you love." Michael and Ryan always nodded, and I believe those lessons had taken root in their hearts. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is for parents to mistake peaceful moments for permanent ones. We thought our family was unbreakable. We believed the values we taught would protect us from the greed and pride that destroyed so many other families. Standing in our backyard on warm summer evenings, watching Eleanor laugh while our boys teased each other over a barbecue, I truly believed we had everything. I had no way of knowing that the life we had worked so hard to build would one day become the very thing that would tear my sons apart. Life has a way of changing without asking for permission. One season, everything feels secure. The next, you're holding on to the pieces, wondering how it all slipped away. For our family, that change began on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Eleanor told me she had been feeling tired for weeks. At first, neither of us thought much about it. We blamed the long hours at the store and getting older. But then she started losing weight, and the bright smile that had carried our family through every hardship slowly began to fade. I begged her to see a doctor. She smiled, squeezed my hand, and said, "I'm probably just overworking myself." I wanted to believe her, but something deep inside me whispered that it was more serious. A week later, we sat together in a cold hospital room, waiting for the test results. Eleanor held my hand so tightly that I could feel it trembling. When the doctor walked in, he didn't smile. He quietly closed the door behind him, sat across from us, and gently explained that Eleanor had an aggressive form of cancer. My mind went completely blank. I heard the words, but I couldn't accept them. Eleanor remained calm. She asked questions about treatment, recovery, and what came next while I simply stared at the floor, praying that someone would tell us there had been a mistake. We decided to fight with everything we had. Eleanor went through surgery, chemotherapy, and endless hospital visits. Some days she felt strong enough to laugh and tease the nurses. Other days she was too exhausted to get out of bed. I cut back my hours at the hardware store to stay beside her. Nothing else mattered anymore. Michael stepped in to manage more of the business, and at first I felt proud watching him take responsibility. Ryan also helped when he could, though he often talked about expanding the company and making bigger investments. I assumed they were simply trying to keep the business running while I focused on my wife. As the months passed, I began noticing small changes between my sons. Conversations that once ended with laughter now ended with silence. They disagreed over business decisions, argued about money, and questioned each other's motives. At family dinners, they barely looked at one another. Eleanor noticed it too. One evening after the boys left, she sat quietly on the porch watching the sunset. "They're changing," she whispered. I tried to reassure her. "They're just under stress. They'll work it out." She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Stress reveals what's already in a person's heart." The tension grew worse after neighbors began talking about how valuable our business had become. People mentioned that the land alone was worth millions if it were ever sold. Michael believed the store should stay in the family exactly as we had built it. Ryan argued that selling it would make everyone wealthy and allow them to enjoy life without working long hours. What started as simple disagreements slowly became personal attacks. They accused each other of being selfish, stubborn, and dishonest. Eleanor hated hearing them argue. More than once, she asked them to stop and reminded them that no amount of money was worth losing a brother. They would apologize in front of her, but the peace never lasted long. One afternoon, while Eleanor rested upstairs, I overheard Michael and Ryan arguing in my office. Michael accused Ryan of caring only about money. Ryan fired back that Michael wanted complete control of the business. Their voices grew louder until I walked in and demanded they stop. Both of them immediately fell silent, but the anger in their eyes frightened me. After they left, I sat alone behind my desk, staring at the family photographs on the wall. Pictures of birthdays, fishing trips, and Christmas mornings suddenly felt like memories from another lifetime. For the first time, I wondered if the greatest threat to our family wasn't Eleanor's illness. It was the growing greed that was quietly pulling my sons apart while their mother was still fighting for her life. As Eleanor's illness grew worse, our home no longer felt like the warm, joyful place it had always been. The laughter that once filled every room was replaced by whispered conversations, hospital schedules, and the constant sound of medical equipment. Every morning I helped Eleanor out of bed, prepared her breakfast, and drove her to treatments whenever she was strong enough to go. Even on her hardest days, she never complained about her own pain. Instead, she worried about me and the boys. She would smile weakly and ask, "Have Michael and Ryan been getting along?" I always answered, "They're fine." It was a lie I told to protect her. The truth would have broken her heart long before the illness ever could. The arguments between my sons became impossible to ignore. They no longer waited until Eleanor was asleep. They argued in the kitchen, in my office at the hardware store, and sometimes even in the hospital parking lot. Michael insisted that the family business should never be sold because it represented everything our family had sacrificed to build. Ryan argued that times had changed and that selling the company would give everyone financial freedom. What began as a disagreement about business slowly turned into years of buried resentment. Michael accused Ryan of never appreciating the family's hard work. Ryan accused Michael of acting like the business already belonged to him. Every conversation ended with raised voices and slammed doors. One afternoon, I returned from getting coffee at the hospital and found the two of them arguing outside Eleanor's room. Several nurses were trying to calm them down while other families stared in disbelief. Michael grabbed Ryan by the shirt and shouted, "Mom is fighting for her life and all you care about is money." Ryan shoved him away and yelled back, "I'm thinking about the future because someone has to." Before the argument could become physical, hospital security stepped between them. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. My wife was lying only a few feet away, struggling to breathe, while our sons behaved like strangers. I ordered them both to leave the hospital immediately. Neither of them looked at me as they walked away. When I returned to Eleanor's room, she was awake. She looked at my face for only a moment before quietly asking, "They were fighting again, weren't they?" I tried to smile, but she already knew the answer. Tears filled her eyes as she reached for my hand. "Promise me something, Harold," she whispered. Don't let anger become the last thing that holds this family together." I squeezed her hand and promised, even though I no longer knew how I could keep that promise. She smiled faintly and closed her eyes, exhausted from the effort of speaking. 2 days later, just before sunrise, the doctors called me into the room. Eleanor's breathing had become slow and uneven. Michael and Ryan arrived only minutes later, standing on opposite sides of the bed without saying a word to each other. Eleanor looked at each of us one last time. She reached for my hand first, then motioned for both boys to come closer. With what little strength she had left, she whispered, "Take care of each other. That's all I ever wanted." A single tear rolled down her cheek. Moments later, her hand went still. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The woman who had been the heart of our family was gone. I kissed her forehead, unable to hold back my tears. Michael quietly cried in the corner of the room. Ryan covered his face with both hands. For a brief moment, I hoped losing their mother would remind them of what truly mattered. But as we left the hospital, I overheard them arguing again about funeral arrangements, the business, and legal documents. Standing there in the hallway, carrying the unbearable weight of losing the love of my life, I realized something even more heartbreaking. I wasn't just preparing to bury my wife. I was watching the family she'd spent her entire life protecting fall apart before my eyes. I barely slept the night after Eleanor passed away. Every room in the house reminded me of her. Her reading glasses still rested on the nightstand beside our bed. Her favorite sweater hung neatly on the bedroom door, carrying the faint scent of the perfume she had worn for years. Downstairs, a half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the kitchen table exactly where she had left it before we rushed to the hospital. I walked through the house in silence, touching the backs of chairs, framed photographs, and the old wooden staircase we had climbed together thousands of times. The memories were everywhere, and for the first time in my life, the house felt unbearably empty. Just after sunrise, I made myself a cup of coffee, though I could barely swallow a sip. My phone rang several times as relatives called to offer condolences, but I let every call go to voicemail. There was only one place I knew I had to go. I showered, put on the same dark suit Eleanor had bought me for our 25th wedding anniversary, and drove across town to my attorney's office. The streets were quiet, and the grey morning sky seemed to match the heaviness in my heart. During the drive, I kept hearing Eleanor's final words, "Take care of each other." I wanted more than anything to honor that wish, but deep inside, I feared it was already too late. My attorney, David Collins, greeted me with a gentle handshake. He had known Eleanor and me for more than 20 years and looked genuinely saddened by the news. "Harold," he said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss." I nodded, unable to say much. Once we sat down, he opened the file containing my current will. It left everything equally to Michael and Ryan, just as Eleanor and I had agreed years earlier when our family was still united. David looked at me and asked, "Are you certain you want to make changes today? This is a difficult time, and there's no need to rush." I looked out the window for a long moment before answering. I've never been more certain of anything. I told him everything that had happened over the past several months. I described the arguments in the hospital, the accusations over the business, and how my sons seemed more interested in my estate than in comforting their dying mother. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he quietly closed the file and asked, "What would Eleanor have wanted?" That question stayed with me. I knew she would never have wanted our hard work to become a reward for greed. She had always believed that wealth meant nothing if it destroyed the people you loved. Taking a deep breath, I explained exactly how I wanted the new will written. Instead of leaving the hardware business and our estate directly to my sons, I created the Eleanor Bennett Community Foundation in her memory. A large portion of our savings would provide scholarships for hardworking students who couldn't afford college. Another portion would support local families battling cancer, helping them with medical bills and everyday expenses. The hardware business would not automatically belong to either son. They would have one opportunity to earn it together. If Michael and Ryan could work side by side, treat employees with respect, and successfully manage the company as equal partners for 5 consecutive years, ownership would become theirs. If they failed, if they fought, or if either one tried to force the other out, the business would be sold, and every dollar from the sale would go to the foundation. It wasn't revenge. It was the only way I knew to protect everything Eleanor and I had built from becoming another prize in their battle. David carefully printed the revised documents and placed them in front of me. My hands trembled as I signed each page. I wasn't just changing legal papers. I was accepting the painful truth that my family was no longer the family Eleanor, and I had spent our lives creating. When the final signature was complete, David placed the documents in a secure folder and said, "I hope your sons never give you a reason to regret this decision." I stood up slowly, looked him in the eye, and replied, "I hope they prove me wrong." With that, I left the office and drove toward the church where Eleanor's funeral would begin in less than 2 hours, completely unaware that before the day was over, my sons would make a choice that would prove my decision had been the right one. The morning of Eleanor's funeral was the hardest morning of my life. I had imagined many times what it would feel like to say goodbye to my wife. After 53 years together, I knew the day would eventually come. But knowing something is possible and experiencing it are two completely different things. No amount of preparation can teach your heart how to accept an empty chair, an untouched coffee cup, or a bedroom where the person you love most will never walk through the door again. The church was filled with people who had known Eleanor throughout her life. Neighbors, old friends, former employees, and members of our community came to pay their respects. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of the woman she had been. People shared stories about her kindness, her generosity, and the way she always made others feel important. Eleanor never cared about being recognized. She helped people because she believed that was simply what good people did. I stood near her casket greeting guests, trying to remain strong. My sons stood a few feet away, but they barely spoke to each other. Michael wore a serious expression, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Ryan looked restless, constantly checking his phone and avoiding eye contact. I hoped that being surrounded by their mother's memory would soften their hearts. I hoped they would remember the woman who had loved them both equally. For a while, everything remained peaceful. Then, during the gathering after the service, everything changed. The family and close friends gathered in the church hall. People shared memories of Eleanor while quietly eating and talking. I was sitting at a table near the window when I noticed Michael and Ryan standing near the entrance. Their voices were low at first, but I could see the tension between them. I watched as Michael shook his head. "You couldn't even wait until Mom was buried before talking about this." Ryan frowned. "Don't act like you don't know what I'm talking about." "I know exactly what you're talking about," Michael replied. "The business." My heart sank. Not again, not today, not on the day we were supposed to honor their mother. Ryan lowered his voice. "You think you deserve everything because you've been working there longer." Michael stepped closer. "I was there every day. I helped Dad build that company. And I wasn't part of this family. You were too busy chasing money." The people around them started noticing. I slowly stood up. Michael, Ryan. They both looked at me. For a moment I thought my voice would be enough to stop them. "Your mother would not want this." Michael looked away. Ryan sighed, but the anger was still there. Then Ryan said something that changed everything. "Maybe Mom should have realized years ago that Michael was only pretending to be the perfect son." The room went silent. Michael's face changed. "What did you say? You heard me." Before anyone could react, Michael pushed Ryan backward. A gasp moved through the room. Ryan shoved him back harder, and within seconds the two brothers who once built tree houses together, who once protected each other as children, were fighting like strangers. Chairs fell, people shouted. Several family members rushed forward, trying to separate them. But years of anger had been waiting for this moment. Michael threw a punch. Ryan responded. They fell against a table, knocking plates and glasses onto the floor. I stood frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The sound of their anger filled the room where people had gathered to remember their mother. A place that should have been filled with love had become a battlefield. "Stop!" I finally shouted. But they didn't hear me. Or maybe they didn't care. Two employees from the hardware store pulled Michael away while two relatives held Ryan back. Both of them were breathing heavily, their faces filled with anger and regret. Everyone stared, not at them, at me, because they knew what I was seeing. A father watching his children destroy the last thing their mother had left behind. I looked toward Eleanor's photograph displayed at the front of the room. Her gentle smile looked exactly the same as always. And in that moment I remembered the promise I had made in my attorney's office that morning. I had hoped my sons would prove me wrong. But standing there watching them fight beside their mother's funeral flowers, I realized Eleanor's final wish was in danger. And I knew the time had come for my sons to learn that love has consequences. They just didn't know yet how much their actions would cost them. After the fight at Eleanor's funeral, I don't remember much about the rest of the day. I remember people trying to comfort me. I remember hearing whispers from guests who couldn't believe what they had witnessed. I remember standing beside Eleanor's photograph, staring at her smile and wondering how the family she loved so deeply had reached this point. But the strongest memory I have is the feeling of disappointment. Not anger, not hatred, disappointment. Because anger comes from expecting someone to do better. Disappointment comes when you realize they didn't. I left the church before the gathering ended. I couldn't stay another minute in that room. The same place where we had shared stories about Eleanor had become a place where her final wishes were forgotten. I walked to my car alone. No one followed me, not Michael, not Ryan, not even the people who wanted to make sure I was okay. For the first time in my life, I understood what true loneliness felt like. I drove home slowly. Every road I traveled carried memories. The street where Eleanor and I had bought our first house. The park where we watched our sons play when they were young. The corner store where she always stopped to buy my favorite coffee. Everything reminded me of the life we had built. But now those memories felt different, because the two people who were supposed to carry our legacy had nearly destroyed it in a single afternoon. When I arrived home, I walked through the front door and immediately felt Eleanor's absence. Her coat was still hanging near the entrance. Her favorite book remained on the coffee table. A small vase of flowers sat by the kitchen window. I sat down in the chair where she used to drink her morning tea. For hours, I just stared at the empty seat across from me. That was where she always sat. That was where she would tell me about her day. That was where she would remind me not to worry so much. I whispered, "I tried, Eleanor." My voice broke. I tried to keep them together. The house remained silent. That night, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Michael. For several seconds, I considered not answering. But despite everything that had happened, he was still my son. I picked up. "Dad." His voice sounded different. The confidence and anger from earlier were gone. "What do you want, Michael?" There was a long pause. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry." I closed my eyes. "Sorry for what?" He didn't answer immediately. "The funeral." I waited. I lost control. I looked around the room filled with memories of his mother. "Your mother spent her whole life teaching you control. She taught you patience. She taught you compassion." "I know." "No, Michael. I don't think you do." The silence on the phone was heavy. "Your mother was lying in a hospital bed and you were arguing about money." "Dad." "She asked me to make sure you and Ryan took care of each other." My voice cracked. "And today you fought beside her grave." I heard him crying quietly. "I made a mistake. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But a mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is saying the wrong thing. What happened at the funeral was a choice." "I need time," I said. "I understand." After we ended the call, my phone rang again. This time it was Ryan. I almost didn't answer, but I did. His apology sounded different from Michael's. Less defensive, more broken. "Dad, I know you're disappointed in me. I didn't say anything. I don't know what happened to us." His voice trembled. "Somewhere along the way, we stopped being brothers." I looked down at the wedding photograph of Eleanor and me. "Your mother would be heartbroken, I know. She didn't care who got the business. She cared about whether you two loved each other." Ryan started crying. For a moment, I wanted to comfort him. That was the father inside me, the father who wanted to protect his children no matter how old they became. But another part of me remembered Eleanor's final days. The stress, the sadness, the disappointment she tried so hard to hide. "I love you both," I told him. "But love doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. I know, Dad. I hope you both remember what your mother taught you." After the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet house. The next morning, my attorney called. "Harold, are you still moving forward with the new will?" I looked around the room, at the photographs, at the memories, at everything Eleanor and I had built. "Yes," I answered. My voice was calm, read it exactly as written. Because for the first time in months, I wasn't making a decision based on fear or sadness. I was making a decision based on what Eleanor would have wanted. And soon my sons would learn the truth about their inheritance. They thought they were fighting over what they would receive. But they had no idea they were about to lose something far more valuable than money. 3 weeks passed after Eleanor's funeral. 3 weeks since I watched my sons turn the place where we honored their mother into a battlefield. During those weeks, I kept my distance from both of them. Not because I stopped loving them. A parent doesn't simply stop loving their children because they make terrible choices. But love does not mean allowing someone to continue hurting you. I needed time to think. I needed time to grieve. Most importantly, I needed time to decide whether my sons still understood what family truly meant. Michael called several times. Ryan sent messages almost every day. They both wanted to meet. They both wanted to explain. But every conversation ended the same way. They talked about their regrets. They talked about how emotional they had been. They talked about how they wished they could take back that day. But neither of them truly understood the damage they had caused. They thought the problem was the fight, that the fight was only the final crack in something that had been breaking for months. The real problem was that they had forgotten their mother's final lesson. Family comes before possessions. A week before the will reading, I visited Eleanor's grave for the first time since the funeral. I stood there holding a small bouquet of flowers from her garden, the same garden she had cared for every spring. I placed them beside her name and sat quietly. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," I whispered. The wind moved gently through the trees. For a moment I could almost hear her voice, not literally, but in my heart. I remembered what she always said. "Harold, people show you who they are when life becomes difficult." I wiped my eyes. I wished they had chosen differently. I stayed there for almost an hour. When I left, I felt certain. The will would not be about punishment. It would be about teaching my sons the lesson their mother had spent their entire lives trying to teach them. The day of the reading arrived. Michael and Ryan arrived separately. That alone told me everything. There was a time when they would have walked through the door together. They would have joked. They would have argued about something small. They would have acted like brothers. Now they entered the room like strangers. David Collins, my attorney, sat at the head of the table, the same man who had helped me change the documents that morning before Eleanor's funeral. Michael sat on one side. Ryan sat on the other. Neither looked at me. David opened the folder. "Before I begin, I want both of you to understand something. This document was created by your father after careful consideration. It was not written out of anger. It was not written out of revenge. It was written because your father believed it represented your mother's values." The room became silent. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Ryan looked down at his hands. David began reading. "To my beloved sons, Michael and Ryan." Hearing those words made my chest tighten, because no matter what happened, Eleanor and I had loved those boys. Every decision we made came from that love. The first part of the will was exactly what they expected. Personal belongings, family photographs, certain items that carried sentimental value. Then David reached the part they had been waiting for. The ownership and future control of Bennett hardware. Both sons looked up. I watched their faces carefully. David continued, "Will not be transferred immediately to either son." Michael's expression changed. Ryan looked confused. David continued reading. "Instead, the business will remain under a family trust for a period of 5 years. During that time, Michael Bennett and Ryan Bennett will be required to operate the company together as equal partners." The room became completely still. Michael frowned. "Together?" David nodded. "Yes." Ryan looked at me. "You want us to work together?" I didn't answer. David continued. "If both brothers successfully manage the company with respect, honesty, and cooperation for 5 years, ownership will be transferred to them equally. But if either brother attempts to remove the other, acts dishonestly, or allows personal conflict to damage the business, the company will be sold." Ryan stared at the papers. "Sold?" David nodded. "And the proceeds will be donated to the Eleanor Bennett Community Foundation." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Michael leaned back in his chair. "You can't be serious." I looked at him. "I am." Ryan shook his head. "So after everything, you're making us prove ourselves?" I held his gaze. "No." I paused. "I'm giving you the chance your mother always wanted you to have." Neither of them spoke. David closed the folder. "There is one more part." Michael looked confused. "What else?" David looked down at the final page. Then he began reading. "Your father has included a personal letter to both of you." My heart started beating faster, because those words were the ones I had written the night after Eleanor's funeral. The words I needed my sons to hear. And for the first time since they entered the room, both of them looked afraid. David placed the final pages of the will on the table and looked at both of my sons. "Before you react," he said, "I think you should hear your father's letter completely." Michael leaned back in his chair, still looking frustrated. Ryan stared at the floor. Neither of them looked angry anymore. They looked uncertain. David unfolded the letter. I had written those words late at night, sitting alone in the house Eleanor and I had built. I had cried while writing every sentence because I never imagined I would have to explain to my own children why their choices had hurt me so deeply. "My dear Michael and Ryan, If you are hearing this letter, then I am no longer able to sit across from you and tell you these things myself. First, I want you both to know that I love you. Nothing that happened can change that. You are my sons. You are the two greatest gifts your mother and I ever received, but love does not mean ignoring the truth. Your mother spent her entire life teaching you that family is more valuable than money. She never cared about how much you earned, what car you drove, or what people thought of you. She cared about the kind of men you became. When she was sick, she was not worried about the business. She was not worried about the house. She was worried about you two. She was afraid that things we worked so hard to build would become the things that destroyed you. David paused for a moment, was completely silent. I watched Michael wipe his eyes quickly, trying to hide his emotions. Ryan looked away. David continued. I want you to understand something. The business was never the inheritance. The real inheritance was the example your mother and I tried to give you. Honesty, respect, loyalty, compassion. Without those things, a person can own everything in the world and still have nothing. I looked down at my hands. Those words were not only for my sons, they were for me too. Because I realized something while writing that letter. I had spent so much time worrying about what they would inherit that I almost forgot what I wanted them to become. David continued reading. That is why I have made this decision. I'm not taking the company away from you. I'm giving you a chance to earn it the right way. Your mother always believed people deserve the opportunity to become better versions of themselves. This is your opportunity. First time since entering the room, Michael looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with tears. I raised my hand gently. Please let him finish. David nodded and continued. I know you may feel angry. You may think this is unfair. You may believe you deserve everything immediately. But ask yourselves one question. If your mother were sitting in this room today, would she be proud of the way you fought over her life's work? Or would she be proud to see her sons choose each other over money? The question stayed in the room, because all three of us knew the answer. David folded the letter slightly and read the final lines. I hope one day you understand that this decision was not made because I stopped believing in you. It was made because I still do. Your mother spent her life believing that love could repair what was broken. I hope she was right. When David finished reading, nobody spoke. For several minutes, the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Michael broke the silence. I don't know what to say. His voice was quiet. I thought I was fighting for what was mine. He looked at Ryan. But I forgot what I was fighting against. Ryan wiped his face. I hate that it took losing Mom for me to understand. I watched them carefully. Part of me wanted to immediately forgive them. That was the father inside me. The part that remembered holding them as babies. The part that remembered teaching them to ride bicycles. But another part of me knew that words were not enough. Promises were not enough. Change had to be proven. David gathered the documents. The conditions are legally bound to decide whether you accept the terms. Michael looked at me. I answered calmly. Then the company will eventually be sold. Ryan looked shocked. I nodded. Your mother and I built that business with love. I will not allow it to become the reason my sons destroy each other. The meeting ended shortly after. Michael and Ryan left separately. I watched them drive away in opposite directions. For years I had dreamed of leaving them a legacy, a company, a home, financial security. But that day I finally understood something Eleanor had known all along. The greatest legacy a parent can leave behind is not what their children receive. It is what their children learn. And now, my sons had a choice. They could continue fighting for an inheritance, or they could fight for the family they had almost lost. The weeks after the will reading were some of the most difficult weeks I had ever experienced. For the first time in their lives, Michael and Ryan were forced to face a reality they had spent years avoiding. They could no longer blame each other. They could no longer hide behind excuses. The future of the business depended on whether they could finally learn how to work together. At first, I wasn't sure they would even try. The first Monday after the reading, they arrived at the hardware store separately. Michael walked through the front doors carrying a serious expression, while Ryan entered a few minutes later with the same frustration he had carried for months. The employees noticed immediately. Everyone knew what had happened at the funeral. Everyone knew the tension between the brothers. They watched quietly, wondering if the company they had worked for would survive. For the first few days, Michael and Ryan barely spoke. They communicated only through emails and short conversations about business matters. There was no shouting, no fighting, But there was also no trust. I watched from a distance, hoping they would eventually understand what was at stake. One evening I visited the store after closing. I found Michael sitting alone in my old office. The same office where I had spent countless nights planning deliveries, paying bills, and building the company from nothing. He was looking at the family photographs on the wall. "You miss this place?" I asked. He looked surprised. "Dad." I stepped inside. "Do you?" He looked around. More than I realized. I sat across from him. "When I was a kid, I thought this business was just a building." He smiled sadly. "But now I understand." "What do you understand?" "Every corner of this place has a memory." I nodded. He looked down. "I forgot that." That was the first time I saw a change in him, not because he apologized, not because he said the right words, but because he finally understood that the business was never just about money. A few days later, Ryan surprised me. He came to my house carrying an old box. "I found this in storage." I opened it. Inside were photographs from when the boys were young. Michael and Ryan covered in mud after building a treehouse. Family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. I smiled through tears. "I forgot we had these." Ryan looked at one photograph for a long time. It showed him and Michael standing beside the hardware store on the day we opened the first location. "We were happy then." I nodded. "Yes, you were," he sighed. "I don't know when everything changed," I answered honestly. "Neither do I." For a while, we sat quietly. Then Ryan said something I never expected. "I was jealous of Michael." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because everyone saw him as the responsible one. He was the one helping you at the store, the one people trusted." He looked down. "I felt like I was always trying to prove I belonged." That was the first time Ryan had ever admitted his insecurity, and suddenly I understood something. Their fight was never only about the business. It was about years of feelings they never expressed. Comparison, pride, fear. The things families often hide until they become too heavy to carry. Over the next several months, things slowly began to change. Michael started listening more. Ryan became more patient. They still disagreed. They still had different ideas. But for the first time in years, they discussed problems instead of attacking each other. They began attending business meetings together. They visited employees they had ignored before. They started making decisions based on what was best for the company instead of what was best for themselves. One afternoon, I walked into the store and saw something that stopped me. Michael and Ryan were laughing, actually laughing, not pretending, not forcing it, the same way they used to when they were children. I stood there quietly, watching them. And for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt hope. That evening I visited Eleanor's grave. I placed flowers beside her name and sat down. "I think they're finally understanding," I whispered. The wind moved softly through the trees. "I wish you could see it." I smiled sadly, because I knew she would have been proud. The journey wasn't over. Trust takes time to rebuild. A broken heart doesn't heal overnight. But my sons were finally learning the lesson Eleanor had tried to teach them their entire lives. Money can divide a family, but love, humility, and forgiveness can bring one back together. And after everything we had lost, I finally believed we still had a chance. 5 years passed faster than I ever imagined. When I looked back at the day of Eleanor's funeral, it almost felt like another lifetime. I could still remember the anger, the shouting, and the heartbreak of watching my sons fight beside their mother's grave. It has been one of the darkest moments of my life, but it was also the moment that forced all of us to change. The 5-year agreement I created in Eleanor's memory had not been easy. There were disagreements. There were stressful days. There were moments when Michael and Ryan wanted to walk away, but they didn't. For the first time in years, they learned how to disagree without destroying each other. Michael became better at listening. Ryan became better at accepting responsibility. They stopped seeing each other as competition and started seeing each other as brothers again. The hardware store changed too, not because it became bigger, not because it earned more money. It changed because the people running it finally understood what it represented. They started treating employees the way Eleanor and I always had. They created programs to help young workers learn valuable skills. They supported local families. They remembered that a business was not built only with money, it was built with people. On the morning of the 5th anniversary of Eleanor's death, David Collins called a final meeting. The same attorney's office where I had signed the new will years earlier. The same room where I had made one of the hardest decisions of my life. Michael and Ryan sat across from me. But this time, they weren't angry. They weren't waiting to see what they would receive. They were simply there together. David opened the file. 5 years ago, your father created these conditions because he believed there was still hope for this family. He looked at both brothers. Today I can confirm that all requirements have been met." Michael smiled slightly. Ryan looked relieved. David continued. "Ownership of Bennett Hardware will now officially transfer equally to Michael and Ryan Bennett." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Michael looked at Ryan. "We did it." Ryan smiled. "I watched my sons shake hands, not as business partners, as brothers. And that meant more to me than any document." After the meeting, Michael and Ryan asked me to come with them somewhere. I was surprised when they drove me to the old family house. The house where Eleanor and I had spent nearly our entire marriage. The house that had once been filled with so much pain. I stopped at the front door. "What are we doing here?" Michael looked at me. "We bought it back," I froze. "What?" Ryan smiled. "We spent years trying to find a way. We knew this house meant everything to you and Mom." I looked at the porch, where Eleanor and I drank coffee every morning. The same porch where we watched our sons grow up. "We didn't do it because we thought it would erase what happened," Michael said. "We know it can't," Ryan nodded. "We just wanted to bring something back that we took from you." My eyes filled with tears. They opened the door. Inside, everything looked different. But then I noticed something. On the wall near the living room was a framed photograph of Eleanor. Beside it was a small wooden plaque. It read, "The Bennett family home, built with love, preserved through forgiveness." I couldn't hold back my tears. For years, I thought losing that house was the greatest loss of my life. But I was wrong. The greatest loss would have been losing my sons forever. That evening, we sat around the old kitchen table. The same table where Eleanor had served countless meals. The same place where she taught our boys about kindness and gratitude. Michael looked at me. "Dad, we're sorry." Ryan nodded. "We know saying sorry doesn't change what happened, but we hope every day for the rest of our lives can prove that we learned from it." I looked at both of them, and for the first time in years I saw the little boys Eleanor and I raised, not perfect, not without mistakes, but still our sons. I smiled. "Your mother would be proud." That night I sat alone on the front porch, the same porch where Eleanor once told me that flowers and people both needed love to grow. I looked at the garden she planted decades earlier. Some flowers had faded, others had grown stronger, just like our family. Life doesn't always give us the ending we expect. Sometimes the people who hurt us become the people who help us heal. Sometimes the family we almost lose becomes the family we fight hardest to save. Eleanor was right all along. Money was never the inheritance. Love was. And after everything we went through, I finally understood the greatest lesson my wife tried to teach us. A family isn't defined by never breaking. A family is defined by choosing to rebuild. And in the end, that was the legacy Eleanor left behind. Harold Bennett thought his family would always stay together. After 53 years of marriage, losing his beloved wife Eleanor was the hardest pain he had ever faced. But what happened at her funeral broke his heart even more. Instead of honoring their mother's memory, his two sons turned against each other in a shocking fight over the family business and inheritance. What they didn't know was that Harold had already made a life-changing decision that morning. He changed his will. But it wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching his sons the lesson their mother spent a lifetime showing them, that family, love, and character are worth more than money. Will Harold's final decision bring his broken family back together, or would it destroy the bond they once shared forever? Watch this emotional family drama about betrayal, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. What would you do if your family fought over your inheritance? Subscribe for more emotional stories about family, life lessons, and unexpected twists.